All right, if I could ask you to be settled, please. The little tinkle bell is calling us to work. If you could gather, please, in this room, we have 2 papers, and then in the next room, we have another 2 papers. So if you could gather and settle, please, just a few more minutes as we get ready to launch. If you could take your seats, please, in the various rooms. Thank you very much. Thank you. You're wondering what's going on. Shanti's not seen this all day. Okay, thanks everybody. We now have the beginning of our breakout papers. John? Oh, great.
All righty, so this afternoon's breakout session is called Disaster, Climate Change, and Public Health. And our first presentation has 3 authors, Peter Tihan, Lisa Lopez-Levers, and Vilia Tervidis. And it's entitled Disaster, Climate Change, and Public Health, Building Social Ecological Resilience. Peter Tihan comes to us from the University of Iowa, where he is president of the International Mass Fatality Center, a certified traumatologist, and an adjunct faculty member at the University of Iowa. The second author is one of our own here at Duquesne University, the Reverend Francis Philbin Endowed Chair in African Studies and a professor of counselor education and supervision in the Department of Counseling, Psychology, and Special Education. And the third author is a professor emeritus and recent chair of the Department of Rehabilitation and Counselor Education at the University of Iowa and the director of the Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Ethics. So with that, I give you the tag team of Drs. Tihan and Lopez-Levers.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. And first, I would like to thank Duquesne University and President Doherty for making this conference available at this really important juncture in our history of the Earth and humanity. It's wonderful to be here. Second, I'd like to give a shout out to our colleague, Vilia Tervidis, who is not able to be here today, but would like to be here with us today. And finally, I would just like to say that it's wonderful to have the opportunity at a conference like this, which was intended to be interdisciplinary, to be able to talk about a social science related issue, especially one that includes, we've heard so much evidence about the hard sciences, and it's really, really important to have that. But part of the point that we wanted to make is there's a human dimension to this as well. So with that, I forgot to find out how to do, how to operate this. I hope I... Okay, I tried every button except for the right one. Sorry about that. So the main objectives of our paper include the following: to examine linkages among disaster, climate change, and various complex environmental, behavioral, and public health issues, to offer an ecological systems perspective, to illuminate the need for better disaster preparedness practices, and finally to propose a socio-ecological model that promotes adaptation and community resilience. Compelling evidence exists that climate change is linked with increasing natural disasters and conflict. We've been hearing a lot about that. There's also compelling evidence that climate change reveals interconnections among disaster risk and environmental and human factors that are very, very complex. And finally, that climate change suggests greater need for disaster preparedness as well as disaster response.
Good afternoon. My name is Peter T. and I bring the perspective of a responder to this research and to the work when we're talking about climate change. Just a little bit, I've done over 49 major disasters around the world in a management leadership. So, and I look at it always from the humanitarian side. And so when you look at the humanitarian threat, the grave implications is not only what it's doing to the environment, the social and the economic issues, but it's going to be what happens to political and distribution of goods. Now we see this both domestically as well as internationally, but you have to think back to the social implications and the economic and political implications of Hurricane Katrina, for instance. I was in New Orleans the day Katrina hit and stood there in the Superdome as we started to herd people into the dome. And what we found is on many of the social implications of subduing disasters, is the people that are most strongly affected are the elderly, the poor, the disabled, and the children. And that was clearly evident in our disaster of Katrina, as I've seen in Haiti and Darfur and Sri Lanka following those great disasters. When we're looking at global change and we're looking at the climate change, we have to we have to say, okay, we have the 1,000-year plan, but what are we truly devoting to the care of the people? The people who are the less affected. I've been in areas where we've had populations where I've had them evacuate a community of 50,000 people. I noticed there was no disabled, no people special interest, special needs population. I said, where are those folks? Why aren't they being evacuated? Well, we don't have a plan for them. And this was after a community where they said, if you don't leave this community, you will face certain death. And yet the plan was to leave 6,000 to their own because there was no plan to evacuate them. That's in the U.S. And so as we look at the disappearance of Florida, we look at Syria, and we look at these other areas, you and I probably have the means of escaping harm's way. But what is it that the very needy, the very poor, the people who don't have the resources that we oftentimes leave behind?
So we chose to use a definition, we chose to operationally define disaster using an accepted definition. So according to the United Nations, a disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society causing widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses which exceed the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. This definition emphasizes disaster as disruption, and it also includes conflict as conflict appears in its various social disruptive forms across the planet. Okay. Due to the increasing number of natural disasters and conflicts around the world and the parallel increase in disaster risk, sufficient disaster preparedness has become a key public issue. It is interdisciplinary in scope, it demands contextual assessment, and it requires a shift from post-impact reaction, from solely post-impact reaction, to a more proactive stance of adaptation, prevention, and fostering resilience. In considering the conceptual framework for our paper, the following question emerged for us. How do we begin to conceptualize a more adaptation-oriented paradigm for disaster preparedness? So I could talk for days from this particular model. Too bad none of my students are here because they would be chuckling. But we're operating from this bioecological model to think about newer ways of responding to disasters. Let me just run through this model very quickly. Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model of human development offers a robust way to understand the individual within his or her psychosocial cultural contexts and to infer transactional implications related to the multiple systemic environments in which humans live. The individual is nested within proximal and increasingly more distal multiple environments from the macrosystem to the meso, exo, and macro systems. Across all of these systems, people and communities are affected by and are in reciprocal relationship with various systemic influences. The chronos system represents both the lived time of the individual as well as socio-historical circumstances. The arrows that you see going in lots of different directions in the figure represent various social influences generally categorized as risk factors and protective factors. So one can clearly see how the elements of any disaster would play out as risk factors, and the degree to which a community or region is prepared then begins to outline consonant protective factors. So part of our idea in using this particular model is really being able to identify some of the various impacts of disaster and conflict on the people who are actually living there and what the various transactions within the environment and amongst the various environments that we all live in then relate to whatever the disaster or the conflict happens to be. I had the good pleasure of sitting in Dr. John Stoltz's presentation earlier today, and it occurred to me that there really needs to be another circle on the outer edge of this called the atmosphere. And if I would dare, the theory that you were actually talking about would have a lot of interplay, I think, with this kind of social ecological model. So, simply put, vulnerability to natural disaster is a bimodal construct, including both susceptibility and resilience. Susceptibility includes the degree of exposure to danger as well as environmental risk factors. Resilience includes the capability to cope, the capacity to recover, and existing and potential protective factors. Much about disaster response involves protecting vulnerable people. We thought that this United Nations text captured the essence of our current climate change-related dilemma. Protecting and assisting the most vulnerable people on Earth is becoming increasingly complicated with the emergence of a number of complex and interconnected global megatrends, including population growth, urbanization, food and energy insecurity, water scarcity, as well as climate change.
In the disaster service mode, we have to take a look at, and as we prepare for climate change and the immigration of large amounts of people out of their areas and into new areas, we have to look at both from the perspective of the responder as well as the victims. Well, oftentimes when I lecture, I say that what are the two most important parts of a disaster? A lot of times people say, oh, it's the plans, or it's the equipment, or it's all of our training. Really, the two most important parts of any disaster response, as we will look at climate change, has to be the victims and the families and the workers and their families. And you have to look at making sure whatever plan you have in place is uniquely tailored to serve the community that they're dealing with. I've developed mental health programs for the military, as well as a pilot program for humanitarian aid workers on the front lines of trauma, as a program I started in Darfur. But it's all different. In the Midwest, if we're having a disaster in agriculture areas, We have to handle farmers different than we do urban folks. But as we see an urbanization going on of a lot of people coming out of the countryside and coming into the city, we're also looking at an increase of mixing cultures, mixing traditions, looking at, how do we, with all the immigration coming on, how do we compact those people into smaller areas, but serve their individual needs and making sure that their needs are being addressed. We find most of the challenges facing disaster victims really stem from the problems of living in the aftermath. The picture here of the folks along the curbside are some of the victims from the Superdome in New Orleans. But regardless of, the most basic human need we have is the need to feel safe. Everyone wants to feel safe. As we see these in this picture, and as we look at all the documents and things we talked about all day today, it's making people feel safe. But feeling safe is food, water, but it is also connecting with their families, making sure that they have a roof over their head, making sure that they have a purpose in life, making sure they have employment, making sure that they feel that their cultures, their traditions, their core values are appreciated in the society they are. And when we look at how ready are we globally for the kinds of climate change related disasters that are already occurring, we really have to take a serious look of how well prepared, that we think they are. Because it's both the short-term and the long-term needs of addressing. It's just not watching the people stream into Europe out of Syria and the Middle East. It's what are we doing to integrate them into our society? What are we doing to care for them? How are we going to adapt and have them adapt into our lifestyle or our traditions, as well as how we're going to adapt to them? And when we look at both short-term and long-term issues, we have to look at, oftentimes they say, when is the biggest traumatic experience when we talk about suicide? For instance, I say, what is the peak for suicide following a traumatic event? And a lot of people said, well, it's 30 days, or it's 6 months, or it's a year. And traditionally what we see in studies is it's 7 years post a traumatic event. So we have an ethical and moral obligation when we're looking at these things, these issues of watching people, that they may be leaving their affected area, or they may be coming into an urban environment. But the stressors that's causing into the populations can't be simply addressed by a few months of response. In disasters now, a lot of times they'll get 6 months or a year mental health coverage in a community. But it's a long-term issue that becomes more devastating as people become more addicted to drugs, alcohol abuse, domestic violence, child abuse, disruption of the family. And so when we're looking at the reality of a response, we have to look at the long-term issues of how we're going to address populations and try to help them integrate into our communities and into a new way of life.
So new trends require the following new strategies: strategic and systemic networking across local platforms and within regional and national arenas, a shift from a sole focus on post-disaster impact activity to one that includes prevention, systematic preparedness, adaptation, and an ecological perspective, and also one of building resilient communities.
That's kind of restates what I just explained was the planning process. Now, we're kind of in the mitigation pre-disaster preparedness as far as what we're getting ready for. In, some of our communities are facing it in the next few years. Some will be long-term. But what are we doing to prepare our educating? And earlier we mentioned that we need to start with the kids in kindergarten and work up throughout school so we can change the dynamics of how they view life, what are their core values. And I think we were talking at lunch, how do we get people to really respect Mother Nature? I was just out at Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, and you look at the beauties of the mountains and the trees, and yet you had kids that never saw them as they stood there because they were on their iPads and their cell phones. And you're thinking, okay, how do we get them to really worry about climate change when they can't see past their cell phone and their iPads? So it's an educational process that really gets to the core of the change. Post-disaster, short-term, long-term. We also have to look at, developing better response practices, making a better awareness of climate change and adaptation, promoting areas of, frameworks for resistance. And we have to look at, again, preparing both the responders as well as the families. Because as this develops more and more and as it enters into our population, into our country, you'll be tasked to do things you never imagined you'd have to do before. You will end up probably making decisions on triage. I've had to do that. Do you live or do you die? Who's going to live or who's going to die today? And Lisa wanted me to do a quick story, and we got about 1 minute here. But I was in the Haiti response, and I was deployed with a medical team. Now, I'm not a medical personnel, but I was employed as a mental health support with the medical unit. We were put in charge of the hospital and at Port-au-Prince. They had 50 critical care unit patients in a building that was structurally unsound, and everybody else was outside. But it came down to we had no resources. I go to the supply room, and they said, we have no medications. I had 24 patients on IVs that night, and I went to get a supply, and they said, here's 6 bags. Figure out who doesn't get them. And we started going back and pulling IVs out of people. That was their life support. I abandoned my patients that night. I abandoned my patients as well as, there was 3 of us. There was an LPN nurse, there was a dentist, and myself taking care of these 50 patients. Because quite honestly, there was no one else. I don't know if you want to have a loved one or yourself in a 50-bed critical care unit and being cared by a mental health person and a dentist, but that's what it was. And we're pulling IVs out because we didn't have the resources for you. And I walked out of my patients. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't breathe. I was sweating so bad. I couldn't stand the smells. I couldn't stand the heat. I couldn't stand my patients crying for their mommies as we're looking at newborns up to 90 years old, and you've got 80-year-old people crying for their mommies because there's so much pain, because of crushed limbs and massive injuries and no medication. And I couldn't take it. I remember walking out and sitting outside the hospital wall there, just standing there at 1 o'clock in the morning, and said, I'm done with this. And all of a sudden the dentist comes out and he says, I can't take it either. I'm done. And we sat there for a half hour with each other and looked at each other and said, if not us, then who? And we stood up and we both ripped the shirts off our sleeves off our shirt, and we went back in to take care of our patients. And it was, to me, that's what I define as a spiritual event in disaster response. You will face at some time in this crisis, be faced with decisions you never thought you'd have to make before. But you will. That's why we need to be prepared, and that's what we're hoping to address in this paper. And hopefully you was, like I, went back and took care of our patients, made those tough decisions. And that night, we lost no one, God willing. But we're in for the long haul here. We have to be prepared, short-term and long-term.
Just a final word, the takeaway here. I think concrete scientific evidence has been presented throughout this conference. Climate change is affecting us very seriously. We can expect, there already has been a huge increase in disasters around the world. Repeating my colleague, we need to really be prepared. Thank you very much.
We can take a couple questions because we have a couple minutes. Is there 1 or 2 questions for the speakers? Actually.
So one of the questions that I suppose I have is,
Well, part of it is developing an effective evacuation plan. What are the routes? How are you going to maintain your evacuation routes? How are you going to manage an exodus of people? I mean, we had 70,000 people trapped in New Orleans when Katrina hit. They had no way out. There was these were people who were mostly on welfare. It was the end of the month. They had no money for food. The grocery stores were shut down. Everybody who could leave left. The only option to them was to come and stand in a building that you were told never to go to in a disaster. So what kind of part of the infrastructure is, with climate change, we expect it to be a slow process. But what are you going to do to move the people from the affected areas to a resettlement area? And is that going to be a permanent resettlement area, or are you going to diffuse them out, or how do you save how do you move them out? In Katrina, it was chaotic. We didn't have the infrastructure to get them out of town. We didn't have the system, the food in place. We didn't have a safe place for them to be harbored in. And so it's, and when you move them out, when we evacuate, we oftentimes evacuate 3-5 million people. We have no place for them to go. They're going to sleep in your parking lots. They're going to sleep in your cars. You're going to, you can open your doors, but that's not a suggested answer to the problem. So the infrastructure may not be from where they're going from. It's what kind of infrastructure and what kind of plans do we have to where they're going to, so the infrastructure can receive them, accept them, and be able to harbor them without being catastrophic community they're going to.
And could I just add very quickly, infrastructure is obviously extremely important, but that's not the only part of the equation. Planning is very important. The government response was actually using a model that had been developed for people in Florida. People in Florida would move very differently in the face of a hurricane. I used to live in New Orleans. People don't leave their homes in New Orleans. And so just the fact that they were using a model that, think about the ecological system that I showed you. They were using a model that had nothing to do with the local norms of the people in New Orleans. They were using something that had been developed, an evacuation plan that had been developed for people in Florida.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.